Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am Dr. Kalila Harris, and I was recently appointed to serve as Executive Director of the Public Justice Center here in Baltimore, Maryland. I first want to give a land acknowledgement. Public Justice Center traverses Lenape territory, which uh, uh, is divided between the Susquehannock and the Piscataway tribes. So want to make sure that we acknowledge the land that was stewarded before we got here, while I thank all of you for your participation. So just want to give an opening salvo to say that we are continuing the work to build a just society here at Public Justice Center. Um, the Public Justice Center's mission focuses on building a just society. We use legal tools, advocacy, both legislative and community advocacy, working with critical partners around Maryland and beyond to ensure that we are disrupting anti-Blackness, working towards anti-poverty and anti-racism in the work that we do. We focus our work on education, justice, housing justice, ensuring people have access to health and benefits that are due to them, ensuring that people are being treated fairly in their workplaces. And we do all of this again through a racial equity lens. Today's session will support our continued advocacy around education stability, ensuring that we are all collaborating and clear about what steps we can take to ensure our children have access to a quality and adequate education, which is the sole responsibility of, or the sole mandate, excuse me, of the Maryland Constitution. Article 8 of Maryland's Constitution ensures that all students have access to an adequate education. It is the only entitlement in the Maryland Constitution, and we are committed to ensuring our students are not experiencing disparate treatment when it comes to being excluded from school. And so you're going to hear some examples and hear some strategies to ensure that we can continue to collaborate in a time where resources and the socio-political landscape is working against children and families and our educators. And so with that said, I want to thank you again for joining. We hope that you will join us for future Justice for Breakfast sessions. And I want to turn the floor over to our lead for the Education Stability Project here at the Public Justice Center, Ingrid Lofgren.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris, for your introduction. We're so lucky to have you as our new leader at the Public Justice Center. And we're also very glad to be with all of you this morning. As Dr. Harris mentioned, this is a really critical time for us to all rally around public education and our students and families in Maryland. We are in a moment where when public education is under attack by many people, there are attempts to dismantle the system that we have, and yet there are so many people working in community, including students and parents, to ensure that children get what they need in Maryland and across the country in terms of their education. So we are going to share with you some of our work focused on school discipline and pushout. If you can go ahead, Levi, to the next slide. So our basic agenda for our conversation with you this morning is to give you an overview of the Public Justice Center's Education Stability Project. As Dr. Harris said, my name is Ingrid Lofgren. I'm an attorney with the Education Stability Project, and I'll be presenting this morning with my wonderful teammate, Levi Bradford, who is also an education attorney at the Public Justice Center. We're going to share with you a couple of stories of students experiencing school pushout that are based on our cases here at PJC. And then from there, move into some systemic issues that these stories highlight, strategies to address those issues, and then how you can connect with us and get involved if you'd like. So in terms of housekeeping, the slides are going to be shared by email. The session's being recorded, and we'll share that as well. And we really hope that you will engage in the chat with each other and with us, and that we can make this morning really interactive in that way. So the Education Stability Project focuses primarily on interrupting exclusionary discipline and push-out. When we're talking about exclusionary discipline this morning, we mean the basic concept of removal of a student from a regular school classroom in response to conduct. We're kind of used to thinking of formal discipline like suspension, expulsion, or school-based arrest. But this also includes informal and unlawful practices like sending students home from school without a formal suspension, or involuntary placement in alternative schools, virtual learning programs, or other settings that are outside of the regular classroom. When we talk about push out, we're thinking a bit more broadly. So it includes exclusionary discipline, but also other punitive and harmful policies or practices that limit a student's ability to engage and succeed in school, and ultimately compound to push them out of school altogether in many instances.
There is a pretty wide base of evidence that shows that push out and exclusionary discipline that we work on is harmful not only to the students who get pushed out, but also to the students who are at the school. Just at a basic level, the students who experience push out and other forms of exclusionary discipline, they lose instruction time, meaning they're out of the classroom. They're also at a much higher risk of repeating grades and dropping out of school. There's also underemployment, and one of the big things that we highlight in our work, one of the reasons why I came to this work from public defense, is that it's an early phase of the school to prison pipeline. It's essentially the school part of the school to prison pipeline, where every instance of push out or a school removal makes a student more likely to interact with the juvenile or criminal legal systems. And of course, one thing that we see across the state and across the nation is that exclusionary discipline is experienced very disproportionately. Black students and students with disabilities, particularly in the US and in Maryland, are suspended at much higher rates than other students. We'll go into that data a little bit more later. But that is one of the central reasons why we are working on exclusionary discipline. This is some data. I really like working on data. So this is some data that get us sort of grounded in what is happening in Maryland with suspension and expulsion. Maryland suspends about 77 students per 1,000. That is pretty high generally. It's been going up in recent years. And it arrests maybe 18 students per 1,000. These end bars right here, if you can see my cursor, are the most recent data that we have. The graph that I want to focus on today is this one down here that shows disproportionality in suspensions. This is comparing enrollment to who's getting suspended. So Black students make up about a third of Maryland's student population, but they receive 2/3 of all the suspensions and expulsions in Maryland. This boils down to Black students being 3 times more likely than white students to get suspended or expelled. And the evidence shows repeatedly that this is not a difference in behavior. Black students and white students and students across the board, based on race, do not behave any differently. This is almost solely a product of bias in discipline practices. And you'll notice too, the students with disabilities experience a pretty large disparity, making up about 12% of the student population, but receiving 25 or 26% of suspensions. This is just a map of where suspensions are happening. The darker colors on this map are where suspensions are more frequent. Um, where we are in Baltimore City, they issue 100 suspensions per 1,000 students. Down here on the Eastern Shore in Dorchester, they suspend maybe 3 times that, and Somerset maybe 4 times what Baltimore City does. We On the Eastern Shore is where a lot of suspensions in Maryland are happening. You'll notice though when we switch to only where suspensions of Black students are happening, that the rates go up almost across the board. The Eastern Shore is still a place where Black students are suspended at incredibly high numbers. Down here in Dorchester, that is 600 per 1,000 Black students suspended. Down here in Somerset, we're approaching, like, if it were 1,000 and 1,000 suspensions for 1,000 Black students, that would be every single student receiving a suspension in that school district. So these are huge numbers of suspensions. And I like to point this out, not only because it is a lot of the data undergirding our work, but it's also, we in Maryland, Maryland likes to brag about being a blue state or a progressive state in a lot of ways. But those of us who work in these areas know that, anecdotally and based on the evidence, based on the data, that we are not past the disparities of the past. We are not any better than most of the rest of the country on this. And we have a long ways to go in making sure that our students aren't being suspended disproportionately. Notice if we go to white suspensions, the rate drops dramatically across the board.
So the primary tools that we use to combat the overuse of exclusionary discipline and school pushout at the Public Justice Center are education and outreach, legal representation, and systemic impact strategies. So for outreach and education, we know that we need to get out in the community, connect with students, make sure that they and their parents have access to our free legal help, and also that we're supporting their self-advocacy. Because students and families are really advocating in schools, and we want to support them in doing that. And also, we know that we have a lot to learn in community from our partners, and that's how we stay in touch with what's happening on the ground in schools. We do provide free legal representation to students and families statewide. We do that through a collaborative called the Maryland Suspension Representation Project. And that is a partnership between the Public Justice Center, Disability Rights Maryland, the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, and University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. Public Justice Center hosts the intake for that collaborative, so folks can contact MSRP, request assistance, and Public Justice Center will either take the case or place the case with one of those partners. And that really allows us to work together to have more capacity to provide representation, but also to track systemic issues and to strategize together about how to get upstream and try to address things on a systemic level. When we do that, our main tools are administrative advocacy, and that could be with local school boards, Maryland State Department of Education, the State Board of Education, or other government agencies. We also do legislative advocacy in coalition with partners, as well as litigation and data advocacy. So again, all of this work is done in partnership. I mentioned the Maryland Suspension Representation Project, then the 3 main advocacy coalitions that we're working with right now are the Maryland Coalition to Reform School Discipline, the Maryland Alliance for Racial Equity in Education, or MARI, as well as at the national level, the Dignity in Schools campaign. So really encourage you to check out these groups, possibly get involved. And of course, this is not an extensive list of all of our partners, just the primary groups that we're working with right now.
I am going to share another poll really quick. If we could take just a second and answer that, that would be great. Let's see. There we go. I'll give everyone a second before I start on my next part. And like I've been saying in the chat, feel free to share any questions or comments or reactions in the chat. Either me or Ingrid will be monitoring the chat, replying to folks as we can, and potentially lifting up some questions as they come in. All right, it looks like we're about 50-50 split with whether folks in the audience know a student who's been unfairly excluded from school or a student who was excluded and didn't have the supports they needed. It's good for us to know. We'll be talking a lot about students who are unfairly excluded from school going forward. So some of these things that we're going to be talking about may be familiar to a chunk of you, but sounds like some of y'all, these might be new ideas, new issues. I'm going to end that poll here. I'm going to share the results. All right. So we are going to, with this next portion, we're going to be discussing a few specific systemic issues that are driving Pushout in Maryland right now. Before we move on to the big picture systemic issues, we want to ground ourselves in how these issues intersect and impact real children and families. We'll be telling you 2 fictional stories that are based on real students that we've represented in legal cases. These stories will show various ways that Pushout happens and how these issues intersect and compound in real life. Want to note at the top, both of our 2 stories describe Black students. This is not because Black students are more likely to violate student codes of conduct or because white students, Latina students, or other students of color don't get pushed out of school. Research shows, like I said at the top, that Black, brown, and white students engage in similar conduct, but Black and brown students are disciplined disproportionately. Most of our clients are Black, and we understand that these policies and practices that criminalize kids and push them out of school are largely rooted in anti-Black systemic and structural racism. So as we go forward, again, these are some questions up here for you to consider as we're going through our stories. As we go, feel free to share reactions, questions, comments in the chat, or if you can, I'd be identifying as you go what you think may be major issues or risk factors or causes of school pushout. We will be at the end of the stories be going over what sort of things within the stories are risk factors and causes that we see frequently. But want to say also, these are not exhaustive lists of the risk factors and causes of school pushout. These are examples to show you sort of how these factors compound in students' lives to create a harder and harder environment for them to be in school.
Thanks, Levi. So I'm going to share the story of our first student. Our first student is 6 years old in first grade. She's bright, talkative, and constantly in motion. She has trouble sitting still in class and often blurts out answers during lessons, but when she can focus, she excels at the work. The student's teacher is increasingly overwhelmed and frustrated trying to manage the student's behavior in a class of 31 students without support. One day, when the student climbs on a counter and opens a cabinet, the teacher is worried she might get hurt and sends her to the counselor's office. The counselor is busy addressing a situation with another student, so she gives our student a Chromebook with a few apps, and the student spends the rest of the day in the counselor's office. The teacher starts sending the student to the counselor's office regularly, and she increasingly spends time with the tablet and apps instead of receiving instruction, assessment, or behavioral support. When back in the classroom, she increasingly struggles to focus and sit still. The teacher, worried she might get hurt, snaps and yells at her for climbing on things. Sensitive to rejection and triggered by the yelling, the student has a meltdown and throws a book at the teacher. The principal calls the student's mother and tells her that she has to take her daughter home for the rest of the day and the next 2 days because she's a danger to herself and others. Now let's jump ahead a few years to 6th grade. Until now, our student's been in trouble a few times and she really hasn't thrived at school, but she's good at tests, so she's been able to get by. She's still easily bored in class, and her teachers perceive her as sassy and insubordinate. On a few occasions, she's gotten into it with a teacher, and the school called her mom for a conference. Mom comes to school in a bonnet and sweatpants. School administrators talk down to her. Mom is frustrated. She gets dysregulated and gets into a verbal argument with school staff who are also dysregulated. The staff perceive Mom as combative and problematic, much like they perceive her daughter, and they assume that bad parenting must be to blame for the student's struggles in school. At this point, our student is in puberty and developing. Her school uniform starts to fit her body differently. An administrator tells her that she's violating the dress code and has to go home to change. She walks to school every morning, so in order to go change, she has to walk home. This happens several times, and eventually, she decides she doesn't want to go back to school. After she walks home, she's out in the community without supervision or support. She becomes vulnerable to trafficking and abuse.
There are a few things in that story that I want to lift up that I think are moments that you might pass by, but every adult in this story is somehow overwhelmed and under-resourced, particularly the teacher at the beginning in a giant class. And the other thing is that when this student is young, is 6, when she has a meltdown, the office staff, the principal sends her home for a few days, but doesn't call it a suspension. Just puts her at home, which would be the result of a suspension anyway. The other thing that I'm noticing throughout this story is that there are several signs of maybe this child has a disability. We don't know because it doesn't seem like anyone has asked that question, but there are some signs that would cause me to say, I wonder if we should at least evaluate this child to see what is causing the behavior that the school seems to be struggling with.
Thanks, Levi. Sorry, I was getting engaged in the chat. I'm really glad there's some conversation happening there because there's really a lot to unpack in this story. There's a lot around family engagement. There's a lot around bias, disability bias, racial bias, racism kind of coming up in this story. So I just want to uplift some comments from the chat around, I used the word dysregulated. And I think there's a lot in this story that implies, and we could be more explicit about it, that the frustration that the parent is showing is so valid, right? Her child has been struggling in school and is not getting the support that she needs. So, one thing we're seeing is that she's very bright and also she's having a hard time focusing, but it's not being picked up on as far as we can see by the school that she might be, what's sometimes called twice exceptional, gifted, maybe with ADHD. She's losing instruction time when she's being sent to the counselor's office. So mom is coming to school. She's being called in because the school is kind of responding in a punitive way to her daughter's behavior that could just be really developmentally appropriate behavior or could be disability related behavior, and regardless isn't being met with any kind of curiosity around the function of that behavior, what's going on with the adults in the school. And so absolutely want to lift up, as Dr. Harris said, the parent has a right to express frustration and shouldn't be regulated to politeness. Okay, so another thing I think, that comes out in this story is we talk a lot about the preschool to prison pipeline, but school pushout really can result in various kinds of confinement. In this story, we see kind of the progression of how the student is pushed out of school when she's quite young and she's out in the community, and again, kind of not getting the support that she needs, and that puts her in a really vulnerable position. So again, hopefully folks will continue to engage in the chat. There's some really good perspectives being shared there. We're not going to cover all of the examples of push out and the risk factors in this story, but we are going to pull out a few systemic issues that we see a lot in our work, and that we're working on a systemic level. So one of those that came up in this school is informal and unlawful send homes. So in our story, the school called mom and said, please come pick your child up, take her home for the rest of today. And the next couple of days, she's a danger to herself and others because she was, she threw a book in class, had climbed on a cabinet. So this is a suspension under Maryland law. There was no formal suspension paperwork given, but this is a removal from the regular classroom environment based on conduct. So it's a suspension that's not being handled properly in the required legal process. So the student and the family aren't being given due process. When we see this, it's typically not documented. There's not necessarily anything in the student's record showing that they were sent home. And we often see that it's a pattern, which suggests there is a need for some kind of support and intervention, whether it's with the adults who are working with the student or the student needing some support. It can often be a sign of an unidentified disability. Depending on what's going on for the child, there should at least be some evaluation to understand the behavior. And so, sometimes parents are glad that it's not documented because they don't want it on the child's discipline history, but that really also allows it to fly under the radar. And so it's something that we also don't have good data on. Okay, so another issue that comes up in this story is the pre-K to 2 suspension law. So since 2017, Maryland has banned suspensions for students in pre-K through second grade, except for in very limited circumstances when a mental health professional has determined that there's a safety risk due to the child being in school. In our story, because that illegal send home was a suspension, it also was a violation of this pre-K to 2 suspension law. Again, this is something that we don't have great data on because it often is the result of informal send homes and it's not really being tracked. There's not a lot of oversight. So we can see you have this graph that shows that there is a high rate of pre-K to 2 suspensions in Dorchester, Anne Arundel, and Harford counties. If you look at kind of the rate of pre-K to 2 suspensions, based on the proportion of students enrolled in each county, Anne Arundel is actually quite high. They're have one of the highest rates of pre-K to 2 suspensions compared to their enrollment, and Baltimore County is also quite high. So this exclusion of very young kids from school for developmentally typical behavior or unidentified disabilities has a strong intersection with implicit bias and racism. If you think about, how behavior of different children is being perceived, what behavior is perceived as aggressive, which kids are more likely to be perceived as struggling and needing help versus just being, having bad behavior and are met with a punitive response. So we see this as an issue that is kind of at the front end of the school to prison pipeline or the cycle of push out for a lot of kids. Some of the ways that we're working to address this are by doing outreach and education, just to make sure that families are aware of this law, and also bringing this to the attention of schools, local school boards, the State Department of Education, and trying to get as much data as we can. Because as you can see here, there was a large drop-off after this law took effect in 2017. But we're still seeing these suspensions, and they've actually gone up some over the past few years. Another issue that we see coming up in this story is this issue of identification of students with disabilities. So there were a lot of signs in this story that it's possible that our student was having some disability-related behaviors, and that there was maybe some accommodations or instructional supports, special education services that could have been helpful to her. Without any evaluation, it's not clear. So there are a few key legal protections for students with disabilities relevant to school discipline that we wanted to mention. These are not exhaustive by any means, but there is a legal requirement that's often called child find, that schools have to proactively identify students with disabilities or who they suspect may have a disability and evaluate them. A parent can also request evaluation. It should be a partnership between the school and the family. The school can't evaluate without the parent or guardian's permission, but there should definitely be communication and resources offered to the family. School systems also have to provide an adequate continuum of special education services. So in our story, it seems like the school may have been under-resourced. The teacher had a large class. The teacher was stretched thin and maybe unsupported and unable to provide what was needed for all the students in their class. It's possible that if our student had been evaluated, they would have gotten the services that they needed, but we do see that a lot of school districts in Maryland don't have an adequate continuum of special education services, and that can be a driver of over-reliance on removing students from school, on using exclusionary discipline to address behavior instead of having adequate placements to meet each student's unique needs. When it comes to the formal discipline process, there are a few things there at the bottom of the slide that are really important. One is a functional behavioral assessment. The student with a disability is having behavior in school that's disrupting their own learning or other students' learning. There's a process that's required for understanding the function of that behavior. what are the causes of that behavior, and creating a behavior intervention plan. So a unique plan tailored to that student to support them and address their behavior. There's also a requirement that if a student with disabilities is removed from school for 10 or more days cumulatively in a year, that the school has to determine whether the behavior they're being removed for is caused by or substantially related to their disability. And if it is, they have to go right back to school. They can't be removed. That's considered basically disability discrimination if they're removed for behavior that is caused by a disability.
Thanks, Ingrid. I'll take it from here. So those were a few issues we saw in the first story, about the pre-K-2 suspension ban, about identifying a student with disabilities, about informal send homes. We're going to read you one more story that deals with a few other aspects of the school to prison pipeline and school pushout. That I'll go over. Again, feel free to continue sharing thoughts in the chat. They've been great. The conversation's been great so far. So our second student is in 9th grade. He's a freshman in high school. He's a big brother of 2 sisters. He plays football. He enjoys anime, manga, and video games. This student takes the public bus to school, like they do in Baltimore City. In February, there is construction on the bus route, so he's late to school every day for 2 weeks. The school marks these as unexcused tardies and eventually starts giving him in-school suspension, or ISS, for being late. During ISS, what he gets is a packet of work instead of live instruction. He tries to do these packets, but struggles to focus and master the lessons completely without that live instruction, so he gets behind on his work. Eventually, his bus is on time and he goes back to class, but he's lost track of what's going on when he gets back into his normal class. He's embarrassed, so he avoids work by putting his head down with his hoodie up. For several days in a row, the teacher tells him to take his hoodie down, which is what the school dress code is. Eventually, instead of arguing with the teacher over and over again, he just leaves class and wanders the halls. The teacher can't leave class to bring him back, so they send an assistant principal to find him. This assistant principal has a reputation for being dysregulated when engaging with students, and our student has often felt disrespected and threatened by this assistant principal in the past. The assistant principal sees the student in the hall, yells at him, puts his hands up and stands in front of him to block his way forward. When trying to get past the assistant principal, the student bumps into him, pushing him to the side. The student is then suspended for violating the code of conduct against, quote, physical contact with school personnel. The school district has a conference and determines that the student's return to school poses an imminent threat of serious harm. And as a result, they give him out-of-school suspension for 20 days, and they place him on virtual learning. The student's mom and dad both work full-time, so he wakes up every day during the suspension to an empty house. Without support, structure, or live instruction, he struggles to engage with the virtual learning program. Instead of logging on to virtual school, he ignores school. He gets very little instruction, so he struggles to stay on track and is basically just waiting for the suspension to be over so he can go back to class. He plays video games or goes outside to find someone to hang out with. A couple of days before the suspension is over, while he's hanging out at a park near his house, a fight breaks out between people he's hanging out with. He's not involved, but when the police arrive, they arrest everyone there. The officers who arrest him for second-degree assault refer his case to the Department of Juvenile Services, and they notify the school district of the arrest. Before DJS completes the intake process, the school district determines that there is an escalating pattern of violence, indicating that the student continues to pose an imminent threat of serious harm and continues to place the student in virtual school indefinitely. The student is now so far behind in his classes that he loses hope of ever catching up and continues to ignore virtual school. The school district perceives his poor attendance and grades in virtual school as further evidence of bad behavior. A week later, he has an intake with DJS, and the agency decides to not refer his case to the state's attorney and instead informally resolves his case with some counseling and community service. However, the state's attorney never notifies the district that the case was resolved, as Maryland law requires, because the case was never referred to them. Many attempts are made with the students' parents to get the state's attorney to notify the school district. It takes several weeks for the state's attorney to send notification. By the time the district finally gets notified, the case is resolved, the student has missed almost half a year of school. He has almost no chance at this point and will have to repeat the 9th grade.
So also really a lot to unpack in this story of our slightly older second student. A lot of risk factors for Pushout. There are transportation issues that spiral. We know that attendance is very connected to school Pushout. There are many school districts in Maryland in which staff are not allowed to support students or to accept makeup work for unexcused absences, but they have to support students in making up work for excused absences. We see here the student was actually removed from direct instruction for being late to school for a reason that was completely outside of his control, and that lack of instruction caused him to fall behind, and so he was avoiding work. But there was not any curiosity in this story around why he might be putting his head down, what was the function of that, what was going on with him. We saw dynamics between particular administrators. That's something that we see coming up a lot in our cases, is just a pattern of a certain dynamic between a particular adult and how they relate to a student, and how that really can cause things to spiral towards a very punitive response by that administrator to the student. So the student is suspended out of school, basically because of that dynamic with this administrator. Again, lack of live instruction, virtual school that's not engaging to him. And then when he's out of school, kind of being in the wrong place, getting caught up. And then a lot of administrative issues, even simple things like the school not getting notified of what was happening with the criminal case, that cause things to compound even more and lead him to be kept out of school for even longer. So I'll turn it over to Levi to pull out just a few of these systemic issues that are coming up in this story that we're working on in our cases and advocacy.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. Yeah, there's a lot here. And I agree with the comment in the chat that these stories are distressing. And one thing that I think is important is they're distressing because if you can imagine your own child experiencing this thing, some of us have children who go through these all the time, and some of us don't. And I find it very important to try and have folks who do not have kids who are going through this to understand that, like, this could be your child. This happens to very like the average child in Maryland. It happens all the time. It is not like these extreme circumstances, and it happens for very minor behavior quite frequently. One thing I want to pull out of this story is when our student is first suspended. They suspend him under what's known as the imminent threat of serious harm determination. This is the law in Maryland currently, that when a student is suspended for longer than 10 days, they can only do that. The district can only do that if they determine that the student poses an imminent threat of serious harm, ongoing imminent threat of serious harm in the future. This is supposed to be an individualized determination, and it's supposed to only remove a child from school for a long time if they pose a danger going forward. If a student gets into a fight, but there's no reason to think that that there will be more conflict in the future, schools aren't supposed to be suspending students for more than 10 days for anything like that. It's just supposed to be to prevent future harm. Whether that happens or not it varies from district to district. The Maryland law uses this term, imminent threat of serious harm, but what it doesn't do is define it any further. So what that means is school districts are very inconsistent with how they define this term, or they don't define it at all. We find in plenty of districts they include within harm like psychological harm, emotional harm, or just like theoretical forms of harm. I've seen a school district claim that selling weed in a school bathroom is an imminent threat of serious harm on the whole school community because there are drugs on campus. I have seen a school district claim that after hours vandalism of a school is an imminent threat of serious harm going forward because of how much emotional distress it would cause other students to have that student in school still. It becomes this very amorphous, sort of vague definition that we've been working for a long time to try and push the state to define further. And particularly, we want them to define it as physical harm, because on all the other circumstances where you could perceive there to be harm, there are good mechanisms in schools for dealing with those harms, rather than removing a student from school. One thing to also point out here is that at this moment, when a student is being removed from school for longer than 10 days, at the suspension conference with the district, this is where a lot of bias compounds. If a student hasn't been to a suspension conference before, what the school who is trying to remove them for a long time, what they will also tell the district is the student's been late over and over again. They've had ISS, they've had any other sort of disciplinary problems or relational problems with the staff, such as like arguing with the principal or an administrator. All of those things that go under the radar that are products of bias compound in this one moment, and the school sees all of it as this child is a behavioral problem and not this child is exhibiting, like it is, has experienced many forms of bias and like minor forms of, pushout that haven't resulted in the kid being removed from school yet before this one moment. So it creates this compounding effect over time that when they get to the point of being suspended, it all sort of adds up in the school district's eyes. Another thing that happened here is what is known as a reportable offense. That's when our student was out at a park and around students who were being around other people who got into a fight. When a student is arrested or charged for a specific list of offenses off school grounds, unrelated to school at all, those charges or arrests get reported to the school under Maryland law. That's what's known as a reportable offense. There's like a list of them, and that reportable offense list very notably includes second-degree assault and drug possession. Second-degree assault accounts for like 40% of all reportable offenses, and that includes fighting or any sort of, the most minor forms of assault are second-degree assault. So in our case, our student was never formally charged, was just arrested for second-degree assault. And because he was arrested, that got reported to the school, and they used that arrest as a reason to remove him from school to determine that he's an ongoing imminent threat of serious harm. Maryland law says that you can't just remove a student based on that charge, but we see very frequently districts do that anyway. One of our forms of advocacy on this front has been lots of legislative advocacy because it's a hot button issue. You may have heard many, Fox 45 reports about reportable offenses, because it is a issue that the Republicans in the legislature right now and at the, Fox 45 really want to push on, because they think anyone who they can deem a criminal should be out of school forever. But there are many circumstances where a student, just because a student is arrested or charged with an offense, actually does not mean that they pose a risk at school at all. But this law is very frequently subverted. And so we are advocating pretty regularly with the Maryland State Department of Education. We're trying to get cases up to the Maryland State Board. And we're trying to advocate on the district level for compliance with this law, only because they're not allowed to be removing kids just based on the charge, and yet they do it anyway. One last thing I'm going to pull out from here is that our student was placed on virtual learning. Virtual learning has become a huge issue for us since the pandemic. Before the pandemic, it was mostly alternative schools, but now when the pandemic hit, every school district had to develop their virtual programs. So now they have what they think of as robust virtual programs they can put students on, and school districts are not perceiving this as like a lesser form of school. But students at virtual school receive almost no in-person instruction. They very frequently are failing school when they're on virtual if they're placed there like forcefully for disciplinary reasons. And there's a lot of disconnection and learning loss happening when students are placed on virtual school. This is distinct from when students voluntarily take virtual school. There are a lot of folks who have like good virtual programs that their students thrive on. With the students that we represent, we see very few of them thrive in a virtual school because the students that come to us for being removed from school are very frequently already disconnected from school and being placed at home with largely very little or no supervision, because almost no families have the bandwidth to sit next to their kid all day, every day, to make sure that they're logging on to school, but also staying on all day and getting their work done and learning. That is a form of like oversight that's only possible for families who have like a full-time stay-at-home parent. The sort of trying to think of what the graph here. Let me just talk about the graph for a second. This is some data from Baltimore County, who reports a lot of reportable offenses, many reportable offenses. They largely place their students on virtual school, and students who are removed for reportable offenses are very largely failing or close to failing. The other thing here is administrative transfers. Because, like I said, schools don't see don't see virtual school as like lesser school. They will sometimes take kids from school and place them on virtual school without any of the due process, because in their mind, they're just transferring a student to a different school. But in our minds, they're transferring a student to a disciplinary school because it's less instruction. It's at home. They aren't allowed to be on school grounds. It is, in our minds, the equivalent of suspending a student. So we are advocating in several cases now against the use of these administrative transfers with no oversight that place a student sort of unilaterally on virtual school.
Thanks, Levi. So before transitioning to this next slide, I just want to pause for a moment and give space for a few deep breaths. Really appreciate the sharing in the chat and the conversation that's happening there, and just want to uplift that. We have been sharing a lot of information and words and toggling between these really intense stories and systemic issues, and they are gut-wrenching stories. I hope that we can all relate in some deep felt way to what these stories represent and what's happening for children and parents at school, and for educators as well, a lot of the times in these systems. And we wanted to not just talk about systemic issues, but really share real stories from families who we worked with, kind of put together in a fictional way, but they're real stories. And we've reflected a lot on how when we go to Annapolis and we try to share with legislators or other policymakers, it often feels like there is such a lack of connection, a lack of empathy, a lack of experiencing how gut-wrenching it is, a lack of people seeing their own children and kind of tapping into, the feeling of being a mother, sister, aunt, and advocating. And so I just want to pause to give some space for that before kind of continuing on with more systemic analysis.
Yeah, we see very frequently that moment where a student pushes an administrator, and the only thing that's talked about in those suspension hearings, especially suspension conferences, is that moment. The like, well, he shouldn't have pushed the assistant principal. And there is no curiosity about the stuff that led up to it because we're not in those conferences, we're not there saying all this stuff justifies what happened. What we're saying is you have ignored the signs that this child needs something more so frequently. What else do you expect besides disconnection? What else do you expect besides a child who doesn't want to engage in school? It is an accumulation that needs to that needs to be considered when they're for every student.
Yeah, and even, I'm seeing Zakia in the chat saying, right, context never matters. And even, the push in our second story, what's the context of that even in that moment? Is it even a push? I mean, you have an administrator who is, himself maybe being verbally aggressive with student, getting physically in his way, students trying to get by him. There's just so much nuance and so much bias in how things are perceived. And it's really harmful. It's scary. So just wanted to pause for that. So there are just a couple more kind of overarching issues and strategies that we wanted to share, not specifically pulling from the stories, but just cross-cutting issues that we're focused on. One of them in this time that we're in is just being clear that civil rights enforcement, civil rights is being dismantled at the federal level and in many places at the state and local levels as well. The Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, it's our understanding that they are still processing some complaints related to disability discrimination, but not processing complaints related to racial discrimination. And we know that the staff of that office and of the whole agency has been decimated under this administration, and this leaves a huge gap. Not that there weren't problems before with civil rights enforcement and education, there absolutely were, but we are nevertheless in an even more precarious time. So it's important for advocates at the state level to be finding ways to try to hold the line and fill that gap. And that is happening in many places across the country. And in Maryland, we and others are very interested in kind of testing our state level enforcement mechanisms, figuring out how to strengthen them, or if something new is needed. There is a discrimination complaint process at the State Department of Education. We do have a non-discrimination in education law at the state level in Maryland. There's a link here. We're going to send the slides out. to that complaint process. So that is something that we can be using. And if it's not working well, we can be communicating about that and figuring out what the next steps are to ensure that we do have effective mechanisms to address discrimination, whether it's based on a discriminatory intent or a discriminatory impact in Maryland.
Yeah, and talking about discriminatory impact, one of the ways that we figure that out, where the impact is the data advocacy that we're doing. I decided a couple of years ago that I wanted to look at the data in Maryland because Maryland, as a state, records a lot of data, but does not publish a lot of data and does not make it very accessible. You'll see that Maryland publishes a lot of raw numbers and fails to give them context very frequently for what those numbers mean. Particularly, Maryland does not talk a lot about where the disparities are and what disparities exist in discipline. They do not highlight the vast disproportionality among many districts for Black students with disabilities being suspended. Data is incredibly important for understanding what is going on across the state. It helps us develop our strategies. We use that data that we look at every year to target areas that have the greatest disparities to make sure that we are trying to identify where the biggest problem areas are. The strategies we use around data advocacy include a lot of Public Information Act requests. School districts and the State Department of Education, I think, are very, very annoyed with us because we request so much data. But personally, I think they should be publishing that data themselves proactively. We are currently in litigation with the State Department of Education over some Public Information Act requests that they denied that we really need the information for. Particularly one piece of data that I really want that I think is going to be critical for understanding how exclusionary discipline affects children is we do not know how much time children are spending out of class, out of school because of exclusionary discipline, and we don't know the disparities there. I've done this research in the past in other states when I used to work down in Florida as an attorney to discover that Black students there were receiving 2 weeks less of classroom time on average than white students because of exclusionary discipline. And that is the material reality of removing students from school, is that you are separating them from the community, but you're also, on the whole, depriving them of more learning, of time in the classroom to actually be developing what they're understanding. And we also share a lot of this data with advocates so that they can direct their work. The data that we produce has been that we gather and crunch has been used by many other organizations to sort of identify disparities and share sort of what's going on in Maryland. We have a long-term goal of making data in Maryland much more accessible. We're working on a bill right now, and we have the hopes of developing a data dashboard eventually. It's been in the works for a long time, so that community members and parents and advocates and everyone can know what is going on in their schools, who's being suspended, and where the disparities lie. I'll just really quick kind of show you. This is what Maryland publishes. These sort of raw numbers with definition, with vocabulary that is hard to parse. They publish the unduplicated count of the number of students suspended, which confusingly means students who were suspended at least once and not the total number of suspensions. They publish that separately with both separate metrics. It is not very easy to understand and parse. What we are doing is we are taking that data, we're using Public Information Act requests to kind of fill in the gaps where they're not reporting everything, and we are synthesizing it to show where what the disparities are, what's been happening over time. This is sort of stuff that they don't publish. How much more likely is a Black student to be suspended than a white student. The state average is 3 times more likely. That is a huge disparity. The other thing that they don't show you is that who's up here but Montgomery County, one of the counties that prides itself on being progressive and welcoming and inclusive. They have a disparity that is just flying under the radar that desperately needs to be addressed. Where Black students there are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white students, and also showing over time that the suspension rate for Black students has stayed way higher than every other student, and that the suspension rate overall has stayed almost pretty consistent. It's not dropped in a significant way in the last decade, which is concerning because a decade ago we passed new suspension regulations that were supposed to prevent more suspensions. They're supposed to decrease the amount of suspensions we're giving, and instead it's all stayed the same. So there's some part of that process that's broken, that it's not actually addressing high suspension rates in Maryland. So that's part of what we're doing and what we're hoping to communicate to as many people as we possibly can.
So we hope that you will stay connected with us. We certainly hope that if you are seeing any of the issues or other discipline and push-out issues that we've talked about today with students and families who you're connected to, that you will give them the information for the Maryland Suspension Representation Project. There's a QR code here. Again, we're going to send this out. And the MSRP website and phone number. So I think I saw in the chat earlier someone mentioning seeing informal send homes, pre-K to 2 suspension ban violations. We would really like to support anyone, any students and families dealing with those issues on an individual level if they are interested in that support. So that's how you can reach us. It's a number for MSRP, but it will come directly to the Public Justice Center, and then we will connect and either take, provide legal help ourselves or get the person connected with one of the other legal services partners in that group. You can also connect with the Public Justice Center on social media, get calls to action. By signing up for those emails. We send out calls to action from all of our programs, human right to housing, workplace justice, health and benefits equity, education stability, prisoners' rights, other race equity, legislative issues during the legislative session. So that's a way to get connected to that. Levi and my contact information is here. If you're interested in any of the coalitions we mentioned, we'd be happy to get you connected there. And if you would like to connect with each other, please feel free to share your information and resources in the chat. Valerie, I see you have your hand up. Are you able to speak?
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation, although I'm debating the need for wine this early in the morning as a result, but I'm going to the Bible instead. I'm the convener of the Black Coalition for Excellence in Education in Montgomery County, and I'm happy that Zakia connected me for this call this morning. I'm going to ask a question you probably can't answer here, but online, but maybe offline, and hopefully. I'm interested in what you have, if you are able to codify, deconstruct, analyze, and commit to paper and words what it is that makes you able to see what you see and respond differently as white people. Because what you do, and it's absolutely necessary, is on the back end. And in Montgomery County, we've spent literally millions of dollars having white people lead so-called anti-racist work, which is ridiculous in itself, inside of a school system that is decidedly racist. And we can't get people of any ilk, polka-dotted, black, white, whatever you want to call it, to address the fear of Black boys and the adultification of Black girls in any meaningful way, and they will not bring in experts to do it. So I'm interested in having a conversation possibly offline. What is it that's in you? Who raised you to care about these things? How did this happen? Because we have all the things on the books in Montgomery County, all of them. We have more resources than anybody in the state of Maryland. It's not a money issue. $3.6 billion we spend, mostly self-funded from the county. I need you to help people like you to understand how you got to be who you are. So it's not a question to answer here, but that is the question. And whatever it is, whatever special sauce, upbringing, Bible reading, whatever it is you did to become who you are and be able to see these things and to move forward and to even say the word Black in this moment needs to be somehow imparted to folks who look like you, or else we're done, we're cooked. Because the back end only catches those who have knowledge that something went wrong. We have children in school who don't even know what it means to be mistreated. They don't know. So they take these wonderful culture and climate surveys and everything seems fine because that's your norm. So what on the front end can you add to your already loaded plate about how to translate this and infuse it into white people and Black people with white supremacist mindsets to even want to see and discuss the things that you are raising here? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for coming off mute and sharing with us. And I would love to connect offline. I know we would both love to connect offline. I will just acknowledge that we know that there's a lot that we don't see and that we always do have to learn also. And I can just say very briefly, for me, I'm not a mother of Black children. I am a mother. I know there are certain experiences I don't have, but I am a mother and I was a sister before that. And when I feel the gut wrenching, I feel it as a mother. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and my children are white, but just the feeling of being a parent is something that's very deep for me. So again, I know you said not a question for here, and I hope we can talk more, but that's just this in this moment, listening to you say that, that's the space that where I felt that. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who shared so much and was so engaged in the chat. It's really our privilege to be with all of you this morning, and I hope that we can stay connected. We're so much stronger together.
Thank you so much, Ingrid and Levi, for this excellent presentation. I'm Kathleen Gregory, Director of Development at the Public Justice Center, and I also want to thank all of you for joining us this morning for this discussion on exclusionary school discipline and Pushout and the PJC strategies to combat it. Thank you so much for sharing your own experiences with this issue in the chat and for engaging in conversation with us and each other about these highly distressing school practices. It's so clear how much you care, and we really appreciate your engagement in this conversation and all you're doing to stand up for students in Maryland and in your own lives. The PJC does all of this work free of charge. We rely on donations from individuals like you who want to build safe and supportive school environments for all by changing laws, policies, and practices. You can visit our website at www.publicjustice.org to make a donation to sustain this work, and we hope you'll consider giving monthly to help us fight for justice year-round. We also wanted to share that we have our next Justice for Breakfast coming up on November 18th presented by our Workplace Justice Project on the PJC's strategies to protect and expand workers' rights. Again, thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation and for helping us take on these issues.
Thank you all again, and wishing you a good day. Thank you for being in community with us, and we look forward to seeing you again.